Video games cause violence. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, and I'm sure you've even heard it said about violent movies or cartoon violence. And I'm sure that you hear it a lot immediately after violent events, such as mass shootings or school shootings or something like that. Politicians seem to always want to point the finger directly at violent media as soon as something violent happens in real life. But I'm here to say that violent media don't cause these violent events, but are rather just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, the first point I would like to bring up is the fact that most studies done on this issue just straight up don't support the idea that video games create violent people. This is the results of a 10-year study done on adolescents playing violent video games. These two columns here, the first two columns, representing females, while the second two columns represent males. And as you can see from the second two columns, males play a lot more violent video games than females, but there's only a mild increase in violence when going from females to males. Not only this, but when compared to this chart here, also from this 10-year studies, it shows that teenagers who played violent video games a lot in their early adolescence, but then drop off in order to slowly pick it back up, are actually have the same level of aggression as teenagers who started out playing very little video game and gradually grew playing more violent video games. Interestingly enough, this right here in the middle, people who kind of play violent video games and then drop off a little bit only to increase a little bit, tend to show the most violence and aggression out of all three of these classes, which is a very interesting concept. Not only this, but a man by the name of Henry Jenkins, who is a professor at the University of Southern California, states that media consumption drops drastically before violent crimes are committed. Not just hours, not just days, but weeks before violent crimes are committed. Therefore, if someone were to say, take a take a video game and be like, "Oh man, I'm shooting the bad guys," and say that someone goes from immediately from pew pew pew, I'm gonna shoot the bad guys to I'm gonna go shoot up real people, that would be a false statement because they weren't doing that before their their crime, like some people tend to believe or let on that they believe. And another point that provides itself to this argument is the fact that if it were true, then we would live in a lot more violent of a world. Not to say that the world we live in isn't violent. On the contrary, it's super violent and it's upsetting how violent it is. But if this idea that video games create violent people was actually correct, then we would live in a much more violent world. This chart here shows how many video games were sold. Here it's showing a steady increase. And while there also has been a bit of an increase in violence, this right here shows that a lot of people play video games, but not a lot of people commit mass shootings. So to say that just because this person who committed a mass shooting also played video games, then video games are the reason that he created this mass shooting, then they would be sorely mistaken. They're confusing correlation with causation. Correlation meaning that this correlates with this, meaning that they happen to happen at the same time, while causation means that this causes this to happen. Saying that it's essentially the same as saying this guy who did a mass shooting also drank water, and therefore because he's drinking water, then the water caused him to have a mass shooting, where every person in the world drinks water, but not every person in the world starts shooting people. So it's just a presumption and a very dangerous one at that. And finally, video games tend to have a generally positive effect on your mind. One of the most important things is that video games increase hand-eye coordination because most games use a controller like this, and most of the time, if you've played video games long enough, you know where the buttons are. You don't have to look down to know which button to press, or where to press it, or what to do if you need to press that button. You just know where it is. Also, you tend to want to keep your eye on the screen when playing, obviously. When you're keeping your eye on the screen and not looking at your controller, your hands are doing things while you're not looking at them, and you're trusting your hands to work correctly in what they need to do. This is called hand-eye coordination, and it connects what you're seeing with your hands and allows you to react very well in a way that doesn't seem completely natural to a human being, because in the real life, if we get scared by something, our usual reaction isn't just to pull back on the stick to make our character run away, but it's to actually run away. Um, so it increases hand-eye coordination as well as it creates emotional resilience. Because in video games, especially hard video games, like I'm sure you've heard of the infamous Dark Souls video game, some video games are very difficult, and if they're a difficult video game, then you're probably going to lose at the video game. But this losing at the video game tends to cause you to want to continue to play the video game, to keep going at the video game, to get better at the video, and also allows you to be able to accept failure and see it less as something you want to avoid and more as something you learn from, and creates an emotional resilient person who is not afraid to mess up trying, not afraid to try at fear of messing up, if you think. Finally, video games tend to stimulate most of your brain, more than hardly any other activity does. Here's the brain, and each part, if you don't know how brain works, then me too, but you know that here, right, it mentions the optical nerve, as well as over here it mentions the cerebellum and spinal cord. These are all parts of the brain that control different parts of your body. But when you play video games, your eyes are engaged because you're looking at the screen. Your ears are sometimes engaged. Say, if you're playing a first person shooter and you wear headphones, because wearing headphones allows you to hear footsteps from the other players around you and know where they are. Not only that, but it activates your hands because you're wanting to. The controller. Same hand eye coordination we just got done talking about. So once that happens, it activates not only your optical nerves but your hearing nerves, and generates or creates information and sends it to your hands, which activates most of your brain in a way that some activities don't all the time. Sports do increase hand-eye coordination, but they tend to lack the hearing part that video games have. And while some sports do have the hearing part and the hand-eye coordination, it's not as constant as it is during a video game where you're constantly listening for other players around you. So in conclusion, video games don't tend to be the reason that people become aggressive and commit violent acts. It's more of a fact that most people play video games, and some of most people tend to can create violent acts. This argument is in no way trying to downplay violent acts and say that, oh, they're not that bad, or that the people who do them are not, they don't have issues in their brain. But the fact that the politicians immediately point to video games is kind of dangerous. Think about it. If video games aren't really the cause of some of these violent actions, then the actual cause of these violent actions are actually just being left unchecked. So we really need, instead of pointing directly at video games, we need to focus on other reasons why someone may become aggressive, if we really want to stop the amount of violence in today's day and age in our world. Things such as family issues or mental health or stuff like that. Pointing something at a video game is essentially a scapegoat that makes it to where if you ban video games and then then you're fine. You're doing what you need to do in order to stop violence. It doesn't it doesn't work that way. There's no easy answer to our violence issue. But claiming that video games are the answer, well, a good way to avoid the real issue. Anyway, thank you for listening to me today. And I hope that in the future, if you did believe that video games cause violence, this speech allowed you to see the other side of the argument and form a new opinion.